I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Mark Turner, partner at Baringa Partners, by Jeff Kelliher, specialist consultant at TNEI Ireland, and Dervla O'Brien, country manager and director at TNEI Ireland. And over the next half an hour, 45 minutes, we're going to take you through some of the material from the Bridging the Gap report and then leave about 45 minutes for questions at the end as well. So as I mentioned, please do get your questions into the chat box and we'll come to them as we get there. My name is Noel Cunniffe. For anybody that doesn't know me, I'm CEO of Wind Energy Ireland, and I wanted to introduce the webinar this morning by taking you through why we decided to commission such a piece of work with Baringa and with TNEI Ireland, and really starting to hone in on some of the maybe lesser known 2030 targets that are in the renewable sector right across Ireland, not just in electricity, but will be a big feature in our overall economy as we try to decarbonise over the next 10 years or so. So all of this kicked off with the Wind Energy Ireland strategy launch earlier this year. So key to our new strategy over the next 4 or 5 years will be trying to place Ireland in a position that we can deliver a zero carbon electricity system by 2035. So hopefully many of you will be aware that we have a target as a country and as a continent in Europe to try and get to a zero carbon economy by 2050. So that means right across electricity, heat, transport, agriculture, industry, that we're not emitting any carbon. But in order to do that, we need to get to a zero carbon electricity grid at a much earlier point in time to then allow other parts of the economy to transition over towards the electricity sector. So the best way to decarbonize is to put a plug on something, especially for heat and transport. That's where heat pumps come in, that's where electric vehicles come in. So making sure that you have that zero carbon power system by 2035 is going to be critical to that. And that's what a lot of the work that we'll be doing over the next few years will be driven by. And in order for us to do that, we certainly believe that we can deliver that zero carbon electricity system by 2035. But to get there, 2030 is a big step along the way. And that's where we need to be able to hit our carbon budget targets and we need to be able to hit our renewable electricity targets. And that's what really kickstarted this work with the team at Baringa and the team at TNEI about 6 months ago. What we wanted to do with the report was show how Ireland can bridge that gap from our old renewable electricity target of 70% renewable electricity to our new targets for 2030. So 80% renewable electricity by 2030. This is the target that many in the industry will be very focused on. It's how do we increase our renewable electricity from about 40% today up to 80% by 2030. But what is probably lesser known in the industry, but is arguably more important, is the other two targets that we're going to have as a sector, and that's for carbon emissions. So by 2030, we're going to need to get the electricity sector down from about 10 million tons, 11 million tons of carbon today, down to 2 million tons by 2030. So we've 8 years to do that. And then more importantly than that is the journey of how we actually go about that. How do we get to that endpoint of 2 million tons? And that's where this report really comes in. So we need to do that within a carbon budget. We need to take account of every single year between now and 2030. How much carbon did we spend on that? And then how much can we save in later years to really stay within that budget over the next 10 years? And I'll get into that on the next slide a little bit. But really, that's where this report fits in. It's trying to bridge that gap between the 70% target that we had in the 70 by 30 report that Wind Energy Ireland produced with Baringa a few years ago, and the report that we produced last year with the team at Baringa called the Endgame, which was very focused on that 2035. How do you deliver a zero carbon electricity sector? And bridging the gap really fits between the two. It tells a tale of how you move from that 70% target and how you get to that ultimate end goal in 2035. Just before passing over to Mark Turner and Baringa to take you through some of the Baringa side of the analysis, I wanted to just maybe explain a bit more about the carbon budgets, because I appreciate it's not something that maybe everyone will be aware of. You'll see in the media in the last week or 2 weeks, and certainly this week and next week, that there's going to be a lot of debate and a lot of discussion on what the carbon budgets are. So just to explain, the government in April set an overall budget between 2021 and 2030. So that's the overall amount of carbon that we can emit in the economy. So that really then sets it up for, do you want more wind turbines, more solar panels? Or do you want more cows? Do you want more electricity infrastructure, or do you want more electric vehicles and heat pumps? You really have to look at every single sector right across the economy, because the budget is economy wide. And we in the power sector have to stay within our budget, which is going to be now set in the next week or so. And the best example that we have right now for what that budget looks like comes from some excellent work from Paul Dean in UCC. So this is where we're at today as a country in terms of carbon. This is where we need to get to. You'll see the power sector at the bottom. We really need to be going from 10 million tonnes down to nearly certainly less than 2 million, if not lower, by 2030. Paul's estimated that we have about 55 million tonnes to get us from 2021 to 2030. Bad news is that in 2021, we used 10 million of that. So we've already used 10 million of our budget. So we have about 45 million tonnes left to get us from 2022 to 2030. It's looking like this year we're going to spend another 10 million tonnes of that. We're still heavily reliant on gas, coal and oil, and in some cases peat to provide our electricity in Ireland. So how can we get off that, and how quickly can we transition? So that's where I'm going to pass over to Mark to take us through some of the Baringa analysis, looking at different pathways that we could take to try and help accomplish this carbon budget, or get as close as we possibly can to it under current policies. So Mark, I might stop sharing and invite you to share your screen.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Noel. Let me share my screen here. Brilliant. So it's really great to be with you this morning and have a chance to take you through some of the findings of the Bridging the Gap study that we've carried out with TNEI and Wind Energy Ireland. As Noel says, this set sits in a series of studies that we've done for the sector in Ireland. I'm sure you've all got the Baringa studies sitting away on your bookshelves and coffee tables, and this follows in that line. It's using very similar analysis and a very similar modelling approach, and there's consistency across that set of studies. But as Noel says, the particular feature of the bridging study is that we have focused on the pathways to 2030. So really looking at the power sector carbon budget, that cumulative set of carbon emissions between now and the 2030 target, and seeing how the different pathways to getting to 2030 can influence that cumulative carbon emission total. So let me begin by taking you through some of the key findings from our side of the work. Then I'll dig into a little bit of information on how we got to these conclusions. Then I'll hand over to Jeff on the TNEI side and let Jeff talk a little bit more about the work that they did on the grid and the power system side as well. So the first really important finding is around the sensitivity of the cumulative CO2 emissions to 2030 on the pathway that we take to get there. And so we looked at two different rates of deployment of the renewable capacity and volume that has been signposted by DEC. So looking at the forthcoming RES auctions, the ORES auctions, and the expectations on volume. And we looked at an accelerated way of deploying those volumes, and then a delayed way of deploying them, which was around the commissioning of projects being either at the beginning or the end point of the commissioning window under RES. And our study shows that 4 million tonnes of CO2 can be saved over the period to 2030 by faster delivery of those renewable volumes. That's a really substantial volume of emissions in the context of that 50 to 55 million tonne of CO2 potential carbon budget. It's around 2 years worth of emissions by 2030 that can be saved just by altering the speed of deployment under those intended auctions. We then looked at what is the best outcome we think is achievable for power sector carbon budgets under the current policies. And our analysis shows that if everything is achieved under the government's climate action plan targets, then the limit of achievability is around 66 million tons of CO2 between 2021 and 2030. That's a significant overshoot on the 55 million tons that Noel just mentioned, which we expect might be the rough range of power sector carbon budgets. Why is the achievable volume so high? It's because of the use of carbon-intensive fuels, particularly coal, peat, but also gas, particularly in the first half of this decade. And as Noel said, locking in emissions in this year, in the previous year, and in the next couple of years makes it really difficult to move the dial below that 60-odd million ton of CO2 level. And we found that because of that, if you do want to move the dial past that figure, solutions are needed to urgently phase out the usage of carbon-intensive fuels and to deploy renewables even more quickly than current policy would set out. And it really needs to be a radical and urgent shift in order to get that figure below that point. And I'll set out in a bit more detail some of the underlying analysis of these findings in a second. So as we've said, previous studies into decarbonisation of the Irish power sector and to a large extent government targets as well have focused on an end point, so a 2030 target or a 2050 target. But ultimately, Ireland is now going to be judged on this carbon budget. And so the total CO2 that's emitted along the way to an endpoint is also crucial. And so we need to get down to a level of around 1.6 million tons per year, something 2 million tons or perhaps a little bit below. And we're here at the 10 million ton per year point. And we need to look at the pathway in between those 2 points. And that's what we've done in detail in this study and in the modeling we've done here. The other really unique feature of this study versus others that have come out previously in the industry is the collaboration with TNEI. And this has allowed us to consider in detail not just the power market and the power system constraints, but also the grid and the detailed grid constraints and the power flows across the system. And we believe that this is the most holistic modeling and the most holistic study of the entire power system outside of the sort of work that would be done in EirGrid or in academia. And this is a really significant step forward in terms of the depth of analysis. And we'll talk a bit more about that work on the grid side as we go along this morning. What that allows us to do, apart from several other things, is to look in detail at the emissions impact of grid constraints. So here we have the energy market and system constraints, system emissions that we've modeled. And then if we layer on top of that the impact of the grid, we can separately see the contribution to emissions that are coming through from grid constraints and transmission bottlenecks. So let me take you through some of the results in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to take you through two different snapshots of what we did. First of all, I'm going to talk about the first two pathways that we looked at to 2030, this rapid deployment of renewables and then a more delayed deployment under current RES policies. And so in the rapid delivery case, we've assumed that the RES auctions proceed according to the schedule set out by DEC. We've modeled those out to RES 4, also ORES 1 and ORES 2. And we've assumed here that the wind and the solar projects that come through in those auctions are delivered as quickly as possible. So the commissioning is right towards the start of the viable commissioning window under those auctions. So here, by the end of 2030, we end up deploying around 7 gigawatts of onshore wind, 5 gigawatts of offshore wind, and around 3 gigawatts of solar PV. And you can see the buildup of those volumes coming online over the next 8 or 9 years. We then looked at delayed delivery. We end up in the same place here. So we still have 7 gig of onshore, 5 gig of offshore, 3 gig of solar PV. What's different is that the deployment and the commissioning of the capacity is right at the end point, the latest possible date under the RES commissioning windows. And the timing of the auctions are also towards the back end of the viable window. So what is then the difference between those two pathways? Here I'm showing the carbon emissions saving that we see under that accelerated case versus the delayed case. And it's quite substantial, particularly around the midpoint of the decade, so 2025, 2026, up to 1 million tons of CO2 saved in the accelerated case in an individual year. And then cumulatively around that 4 million tons of CO2 saved over the decade, so around 2 years worth of power sector emissions. So that's the first snapshot to take away from the work. Then we looked at this limit of ambition. We were trying to determine what do we think is the best carbon budget that's achievable under current policies. And with the assumed build profile for this accelerated case, this accelerated decarbonisation, we assumed the same project schedule as our rapid delivery case, so towards the front end of possible commissioning windows under RES, but we assumed that more capacity was procured in the auctions. So the volume was set to be the maximum under DEC's schedule. And we've assumed here that the Climate Action Plan capacity targets for 2030 are all achieved. So here we're achieving 8.2 gigawatts of installed onshore wind by 2030, alongside the 5 gig of offshore and 3 gigawatts of solar PV. So in this case, in terms of the RESI percentage, we are exceeding the 80% renewable target for 2030. We're actually achieving a 90% target in terms of RESI by 2030, as we're showing on the left-hand chart here. So you can see onshore renewables building up over time, and then we have the first offshore delivery in 2028. Then on the right-hand side, we show the declining carbon emissions under this pathway. We've got the day-ahead schedule shown in blue. So these are the market-driven emissions. And then we've got the additional emissions driven by the system DS3 limits in pink, and then the network constraints and network bottlenecks in grey. But here we're achieving also the 2 million ton 2030 target for CO2 under the Climate Action Plan. So in this pathway that achieves all of the power sector targets in the Climate Action Plan, we found that we still emit 66 million tons of CO2 over the carbon budget period 2021 to 2030. So this is a significant overshoot on the 55 million ton potential target that Noel referred to at the start. Just to compare this then to some other studies and key studies in the industry, particularly Airgrid's Shaping Our Electricity Future Roadmap. Just for comparison, in our analysis, that shaping roadmap would result in around 72 million tons of CO2 cumulatively over the decade. The other interesting feature here is the quantity of emissions that are being driven by constraints. And so out of that 66 million, a total of 15 million tons of CO2 are being driven by system and transmission constraints. So that's around 23% of the total emissions over this period, which are constraint driven. And of that, around 6 million tons of CO2 are coming from network constraints alone. And achieving this 66 million tons of CO2 is not straightforward. So it's key to emphasize how much needs to happen just to reach this 66 million ton point. There's the level of renewable deployment that I referred to, but this also assumes that there's build out of enabling technologies through the decade to 2030. So things like sources of flexibility to help manage oversupply of renewables. That could be things like interconnection, demand side response, energy storage. We need, in this case, to have zero carbon system services coming online. So again, battery assets, other assets like synchronous condensers to help to unwind those DS3 limits and to moderate curtailment. We also need substantial development of the transmission network. So we need all of the projects identified in the shaping roadmap, and we need further upgrades to circuits on top of that. And Jeff will talk a bit more about some of the other technical innovations that might be needed, but things like dynamic line rating, power flow control, storage assets embedded within the distribution and transmission network, all of that needs to happen in order to get to 66 million tons. And so where are these emissions coming from? Here we're showing the source of the emissions by fuel type. And you can see here that it's the continued use of carbon intensive fuels, coal, peat, gas, particularly in the first half of the decade, which is making it very difficult to get below that 66 million tons. Noel referred to the 10 million ton run rate per year right now. We have around 45 million tons of CO2 being emitted in the first half of this decade alone. And so we're locking in substantial emissions, which are making it very difficult to move the dial on the overall carbon budget. And so you can see with the degree of interventions that are needed to get to 66 million, we really have to have major and radical interventions urgently in order to move the dial past that figure. And we need to look at, first of all, how do we phase out and displace as quickly as possible some of these carbon intensive fuels from the system? And what are the options to accelerate even further the deployment of onshore renewables in the early part of the decade, and also to bring forward as far as possible offshore deployment earlier than 2028. And then finally, I think with cost of living and particularly energy costs being so top of everyone's mind at the moment, we looked at what the end consumer cost or benefit picture looked like for this 66 million ton pathway. And we looked at that versus the Shaping Our Electricity Future roadmap. So the shaping build out of assets and the grid, which hits that 72 million ton cumulative total. We found that the accelerated pathway saves 6 million tons of CO2, but also results in a net saving to end consumers of around 600 million euros over the decade. And that's because the cost of supporting the additional renewable capacity is being outweighed by some of the benefits of the low variable cost of power generation from renewables. So the savings in lower wholesale electricity prices are resulting in a substantial net benefit alongside the benefits of removing some of those DS3 limits. And the savings really are coming here from the savings in the cost of gas and in the cost of carbon. And the assumptions we used for this particular cost analysis were rooted in a gas price and in a carbon price, which was in fact a fraction of today's level. So these benefits would be substantially greater if we redid this analysis in this post Ukraine crisis situation. So just to conclude and recap with the key findings from the study from our side, we found that the cumulative CO2 emissions to 2030 are really sensitive to the pathway that we take to get to 2030. So 4 million tons of CO2 can be saved by faster delivery of renewables under the RES and the ORES schedule. That's 2 years worth of emissions. We showed that 66 million tons of CO2 from now to 2030 is the best outcome achievable for the power sector under current policies. And that's because of the lock-in of carbon-intensive generation this year and in the near term, in the first half of the decade, which is making it difficult to move past that point. If we are to get below 66 million, we need really major interventions to move the dial. And that needs to displace those fossil fuel emissions as quickly as possible. And we have to push forward onshore renewables and offshore even more quickly than the current policies would suggest. So let me pause there on the Baringa side, and I'll perhaps then hand over to Noel to tee up TNEI to expand a little bit on the grid side.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark, for that really great overview of the analysis. I think what is really striking in your analysis is that the importance of being able to utilize renewable energy as efficiently as you possibly can when it's being built. And key to that is having the infrastructure there through the transmission grid, through the enabling system services, from battery storage, from interconnection, from demand response, to be able to get us to that point. So very important part of the analysis covered by Mark. The second then part of the analysis, I'd like to invite Jeff Kelliher, specialist consultant in TNEI Ireland, to take us through. And that's really how the electricity grid fits into this picture. So we've seen Air Grid Shaping Our Electricity Future strategy published last year. This work that Jeff's about to present really builds upon that and shows what we need to do in addition to that and the options available to us to help enable a lower carbon electricity grid by 2030. So Jeff, might pass over to you. And just a reminder to everybody, please do get your questions in the chat box. There's a few popping in there now, and we'll cover that off in the Q&A in about 15 minutes or so. Thanks. I think you're on mute, Jeff, just in case.
Okay.
There we go.
Very good morning, everyone. It is great to be here. These next few slides provide a high-level overview of what TNEI brought to the project, and complement a lot of what Mark discussed there. Our focus was on how to complement Baringa's power market modeling by adding a grid perspective to the analysis. In working with Baringa, I guess the trick was to combine these at times very different types of analysis, that is market and grid, into a single coherent approach. And the result was quite a streamlined market to grid model, and it did produce quite a comprehensive strategic assessment of the Ireland power system. I think between Noel and Mark, we've probably covered some of this ground as to why bridging the gap. From a TNEI point of view, I guess what we were interested in was, what does an 80% RESI power system need to look like? Where can we place further RES on the system? Can new technologies help? And overall get a feel, I guess, for the difficulty of the challenge ahead. I think context is important here. Ireland has a relatively small power system. The system peak is approaching about 5.5 gigs, and there's a similar level of renewable generation installed, and it's taken about 20 years to achieve that. It's a 40% RESI power system at the moment, operating at 70% SNSP sometimes, and it's mostly 110 kV grid with some 220 kV grid and a little 400 kV grid. The challenge is to add nearly 10 gigawatts of res to this power system in a fairly short period of time. There were 5 main work streams in the TNEI grid analysis. First, the key was to carry out some benchmarking with the air grids shaping our electricity future. The second was to carry out a detailed system needs assessment, so a full N and N-1 analysis to identify thermal loading issues, voltage issues. Then it was, where to locate the future generation. That's a major complication for such an ambitious study. So we would have used an approach where we applied a security constraint optimization to identify where generation could locate based on capacity, but also to minimize constraint elsewhere on the system. And we did something similar for battery storage, and probably a key to the analysis here, and Mark has mentioned this as well, is some dispatch down analysis from a network constraint point of view that aligned and fed into the oversupply and curtailment calculations that Baringa undertook. This is a slide describing the benchmarking. The map on the left is the map that's published in the Shaping Our Electricity Future publication, and the map on the right is the Bridging the Gap equivalent. One probably needs to study the details of the map, but we were quite happy that there was a good, strong match. Any needs assessment of Ireland in an 80% RES-E system can end up highlighting quite a few overloaded circuits. But at a high level, most of these are located in the Dublin and Greater Dublin area, in the northwest, and some in the south of Ireland. The Dublin and Greater Dublin area also experiences widespread voltage issues indicated by those brown markers. Once we benchmarked our model against the air grid model, we set about building scenarios, and Mark has given some more detail on these. I guess from a grid point of view, we simply focus on accelerated decarbonisation. It's the only game in town, and that was the basis of our grid analysis. A key platform for the grid analysis was in modelling the operational constraint. In particular, what this really means is, how EirGrid removes the must-run conventional plant from the system over the course of the horizon. And even if all the shaping projects were delivered, there can be no high res-E power system without the removal of these operational constraints. So we developed a logic for how we could do this by removing operational constraints in the south when the new STATCOMs arrive, when reactors arrive, when synchronous condensers are put in place, and interconnection as well. But in addition to all this, we still required some new reactive compensation, particularly in the northwest and in the Dublin region. The basis for much of the grid analysis was in determining where to put the large additional volumes of future res. We used an optimization approach to do this. The results show that Dublin was a standout, if obvious, location for further generation. It was clear that solar could be well accommodated on the 110 kV network, but that onshore probably could not. And it was kind of clear from the analysis that onshore had to utilize more of the 220 kV grid and the 400 kV grid, where there is capacity or potential for additional capacity. And this aligns with the urgency required here, to make large scale res connections where possible, to make sure that by the middle of the decade that there are RES-E gains and ultimately carbon reductions as well. We performed a similar enough exercise for the battery storage side of the project. Multiple standout locations throughout the country, unsurprisingly in areas with high constraint, but it was clear from the analysis that longer duration technologies were required, in particular if the technologies were to be located inside the area of constraint to have most effect. We also examined the effect of other types of technologies that aren't in use on the system yet, in particular dynamic line rating and power control technologies. For dynamic line rating, we highlighted the main opportunities in the Northwest, where lines are already uprated, but there are plenty of other potential candidates throughout the country. You know, in general, dynamic line rating should provide more capacity throughout the year. Power control technologies, from our assessment, we probably didn't see a huge value on the 110 kV network. So we focus more on the 220 kV network, in particular throughout the south, near where interconnection and conventional and res interacts. Similarly in the Dublin area as well, where power control is likely to be needed, with large volumes, again, of conventional interconnection and res interacting in quite a dynamic environment. We examined how network constraint could develop throughout the decade. We looked at 4 spot years, and this aligns with the accelerated decarbonisation, where res is aggressively brought forward. From a network point of view, if this happens, the grid won't be there. So, you know, the analysis predictably bore out high network constraint. But as you can see, when the network does arrive at the latter part of the decade, that constraint does relax. But that is based on all of shaping and some projects beyond shaping materializing. To wrap up, the analysis certainly, the benefit of the grid analysis certainly highlighted the challenges and probably leaves one's head in a spin. From left to right, the grid delivery is extremely ambitious. You know, to deliver what is even in train and not necessarily in the strategy would be a major accomplishment, in, not to mention the additional projects that we did identify. The connection and access policy, you know, obviously will need some improving to allow the res connections to ramp up immediately and at scale. Dispatch down will need to be grappled with. There needs to be some mechanism to manage the oversupply, curtailment and constraint. Interconnectors need to function. We all can't be assuming to be exporting into the Irish Sea at the same time. And res connections, they just need to be delivered at scale, you know, to align with that urgency that is required here. The market needs to facilitate all of this. If the market is designed, you know, the market can deal with certainly the dispatch down issue. And new technologies, the new technologies, they just need to be delivered now in advance of the grid materializing. If res is brought forward, the new technologies can mitigate the network constraint. And last but not least is the operational change, the challenge in operations. All these changes will bring high complexity to operating a grid. So operations needs to start thinking, operations in EirGrid specifically needs to think about how all these things can be managed in a real-time environment. That's the end of my presentation, Noel.
Super stuff. Thanks very much, Jeff, for taking us through that. And I'm sure we'll dive a little deeper into some of the analysis in some of the questions now. Just a reminder to people, the Q&A, we'll get going on it in a few minutes now. We have a few questions in there. If people want to drop in more questions, you're more than welcome. I'd like to invite maybe Mark, Jeff and Dervla, if you'd like to join us for the Q&A panel, maybe to turn on your cameras and we can start getting into it. Maybe to talk through just for a second some of the main key takeaways that we learned in Wind Energy Ireland from this analysis, because it does cover a lot. It's very wide sweeping. Probably the 3 key takeaways, and then one more if you want to go further, is firstly the importance of accelerating renewable development from onshore renewables, wind and solar in the short term. It's very clear from Mark's analysis that 2022 to 2026 is when most of this damage is going to be done in terms of achieving carbon budget. So the quicker that we can enable onshore renewables to get onto the grid in that time frame, then the more we can push off some of those really carbon intensive fuels. So that means we need a better planning system. We need to prioritize renewables if we possibly can, and we need renewable projects to be coming through the planning system at a much faster rate than they currently are doing. The second thing is that grid infrastructure is so important. Jeff, you've really talked us through it there. Delivering on the Shaping Our Electricity Future strategy is going to be challenging, but it's not going to be enough if we want to actually stay within those carbon budgets. So being able to roll out grid at a fast rate, being able to get planning for a grid, again, to go back to that, the planning system needs to improve to enable grid infrastructure. That's going to be very important. And critical to this is going to be political and public support for grid. I think we're beyond the point now where we can have local opposition, local politicians opposing grid infrastructure. It needs to be a case that everyone gets on board with this. We're creaking at the seams in terms of security of supply. Our electricity grid is really getting stretched. So we as a country need to get behind new infrastructure, be it cables, be it pylons, be it substations. We need it. And that's what this analysis is clearly calling out. Third takeaway from us in WEI was the importance of removing fossil fuel generation as backup to the grid. So both Mark and Jeff, you both touched on the need to transition the system towards using the renewables as efficiently as we can. So higher levels of SNSP, lower requirements for thermal generation to stay on the system at all times. So for that you need new technologies. We need battery storage, interconnection, demand response, synchronous condensers. We need to get them on the grid as quickly as possible. And that's only the three takeaways to stay within the 66 million objective that we've shown here is the best achievable right now based on current methodology, current policies. If we want to go beyond that, and it's very likely that we'll need to go beyond that to stay within the budget, that's where you need to accelerate the delivery of offshore. So you need to get more, you need to get the planning system right, we need to get the grid connection right, and we need to get the route to market right. So ORES design becomes very important, how offshore projects connect onto the grid and how quickly they can, and then how quickly they can get planning. That's really going to determine, can you deliver them before 2028? And then probably the other main takeaway is around the carbon intensive fuels. How can we get them off the system at a faster rate than we currently are aiming for? And some of the questions are pointing to that in the chat. So just with that, that was certainly the takeaways that we took from it in the WEI team. We might get into some of the questions now. So I think the first question is from Stephen Agnew in Renewable NI. And the question I'd say for you, Mark, so why is there a rise in emissions predicted between 2026 and 2027? And I imagine it's to do with maybe renewable deployment and demand.
Yes, it's a really interesting question. So this comes down really to the pattern of renewable build that we have assumed in the scenario. If I just pop the slide back on the screen here briefly. So I think this is the chart you were referring to, Stephen. So we have this decline in emissions over the next 4 or 5 years. Then it flatlines. It actually increases slightly through 2026 to 27, and then we get a step down through 28 to 2030. And then if I just wheel back to the assumed renewable deployment, this helps to map against that. So here we've assumed delivery under RES at the sort of soonest we think is possible. So the earliest commissioning dates, and you can see then a chunk of capacity coming online, onshore wind and solar, RES 2 2024, RES 3 2025, RES 4 2026. But then we have a flat line for a couple of years until we get the first delivery of offshore wind. So we flatline on renewables because we've deployed everything that's under the climate action plan target. We've done that as quickly as we can, but demand is still growing. And so you've got this pressure on demand. You don't have additional build out of renewables. And that's where we end up flatlining on emissions here. And then you can see the big step down in 2028. So the offshore projects, when they do come online, have a really substantial downward impact on emissions. So they contribute a lot of generation. They're big projects, they're blocks of volume. and they come on and they do move the dial quite quickly. And that's why I think Noel's point on bringing forward that deployment as far as possible would have a big impact. So you start to really get the emissions down in a very meaningful way with those offshore projects. But obviously there's a limit to how quickly they can be deployed. And so displacing the early years emissions is therefore the key around onshore renewables that can be deployed a bit more quickly.
And maybe just the next question, Mark, is very I think it's very focused around this slide as well, actually. And I think, Eamon, and you probably asked it in advance of seeing this slide. I noticed it came in. So it was, how could we give an indication for if we were to be able to remove coal generation and other intensive fossil fuels from the system at an earlier point in time? What benefit would that provide to the overall, say, budget that we're working within between now and 2030?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So the coal-fired contribution to the cumulative emissions, so the pink area on this chart is around 10 million tons of CO2. So that's, I think, around 15% of the total emissions over the period we're looking at here. And then we've got additional contribution from, I guess, certainly a little bit of oil, a little bit of peat. And I think I saw a question come up around that oil-fired generation as well, which
can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, that also a really good question. So we still have in our scenario here some oil-fired capacity online, particularly in the early years. So the majority of that is at Tarbert. So we have Tarbert online as it is now, and we have Tarbert running for a number of hours per year in the near term. We then have that coming offline. We still actually have some oil-fired capacity remaining. It doesn't run a huge amount once you get into the middle of the decade. But in total, I'm just looking at the figures from the report here just to get the exact ones. I think so we have the fossil gas-fired plant emitting 54 million tons of the total, so that's 82%. And then oil is 1 million tons. Peat contributes 1.5 million tons. So I think if you sum up coal, oil, and peat, if my maths is correct, it's 12.5 million tons, and it's around 18.5%. So just shy of 20% of total emissions just in those very intensive fuels.
And I think the interesting point that was made to me, Mark, around this is that the more you use your carbon budget in the initial part of the decade, the less space you have available in the latter half of the decade. And that becomes very important because other parts of the economy want to decarbonize and they want to use the electricity sector to do that. So by using, say, more of our budget earlier, we're actually leaving less space for growing electricity demand later in the decade because of things like electrification. So this actually impacts things like heat pumps and electric vehicles and the need to, I guess, allow demand to grow to facilitate them over time. And not having the carbon to spend on that because you're using it at such an earlier point in the decade. So I think that's a really big takeaway from the report. The quicker that we can phase out this really carbon intensive fuel, the better. And I guess the challenge is going to be balancing that with security of supply.
Yeah, and I think that the security of supply point is really crucial. And again, an incredibly important and sort of urgent topic in the market. And I guess a lot of that, the concern around closing or forcing offline the oil-fired plant, the coal-fired plant, is around security of supply. Do we actually need that volume? And I think, clearly in an ideal world, we would not need that capacity to be there. We would have lower carbon alternatives. But in my mind, there's a distinction here between capacity existing and capacity running. And it's running the capacity that's the problem for CO2 emissions. So there is not necessarily a problem having the capacity there for ultimate backup purposes in the near term for very difficult periods in the winter. And, in the current climate, it'd be very difficult to simply remove all of the capacity of the system. But the key is not to be relying on it for bulk energy in the way that we are currently, particularly with coal. And you see the volume of pink in this bar, that's quite a lot of running that we're seeing in the near term. That's not just propping up peak demand hours in winter. This is bulk energy generation, and that is what's really problematic from a carbon budget perspective.
Exactly, and we've actually had, this isn't the first time, this wouldn't be new, running the system without coal on all the time. We had some years in 2018 and 2019, I think even 2020, where there was very little running of the coal generation, and we managed to get power sector emissions down to about 8 million tons. So it's only in the last 2 years or so that we've actually increased that back up from 8 million towards that 10 million mark due to the additional running of that coal generation. For the next question that's come in, it's come in from Eamon Carroll. I might throw it open to Jeff and Dervla initially for comment, just around the battery storage and the benefit of battery storage to reduce constraint in high areas of constraint. Could you comment on that a little bit, and then maybe talk about the duration of storage that we might need to see on the system? And Mark, I might invite you in on that as well to talk a little about the Game Changer report that you published a few months back. So Jeff or Dervla, do you want to have a go first?
Like, I suppose the way it was analyzed, you know, it was just purely to remove constraint. So there wasn't a particular focus in, you know, determining what the optimal size or type technology, but it was quite clear that, you know, you're talking about that, you know, it's not going to be a 4 or 6 hour type of battery. You know, we definitely found that having, you know, a battery inside the area of constraint, we'll say like Donegal as an example, you know, if you're going into Donegal with a battery, that battery, you know, it needs to be of a long duration to avoid being constrained itself. So it certainly has to, you know, be of the order of you know, the kind of 24-hour plus type of technology. Like we did see a benefit for all types of magnitude of batteries, you know. That's the other aspect. You know, generally, you know, that there was quite a the results were quite positive in terms of where we could locate them. That there wasn't a cost benefit associated with them. You know, we were purely looking at trying to, you know, remove megawatt network constraint. That was the key focus there. I don't know if the guys want to add more to that.
No, Jeff, I think you've covered it off there. With it's going to take different types, different durations of batteries, because they're all going to be potentially playing a different role, from system services to constraints in particular areas and how much constraints. It's also dependent, the duration is dependent on what constraint you're trying to reduce. Is it solar, which probably would require shorter term, or if it's wind dominated in a particular area like Donegal or like Mayo or like Galway, you'd be looking towards a longer duration battery. But I think Jeff has covered off the bulk of it there.
I guess just the other part of how we consider.
Did we just lose Jeff and Dervla? Are you still there, Mark? I think you are.
I'm here. I'm still here.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, we lost the punchline there. We might let's see. I think maybe Jeff and yeah, I see. Let me see.
It looks like they may still be online, but maybe let.
I think Dervla, we might have Dervla back and just bring in Jeff in now.
I hope it's some punchline coming from Jeff now. Anticipation.
Indeed. Give us 1 sec, Jeff. I'm not sure what happened there, but we've got you back, I think.
Yeah, I think we were relegated to attendee status there for a while, Noel. No, I was just going to add that, you know, a key consideration by certainly like the likes of 2030 was having batteries for reserve, for for conventional plant, and probably in particular as well interconnection. So it was mainly network constraint, but then it was important to have some reserve for some of those large connections, whether to be offshore as well, having reserve for offshore. That was all I was going to add. Not much of a punchline, maybe.
It was good enough. Good tee in for Mark. Mark, do you want to have a talk about the game changer report that you've done with our colleagues in Energy Storage Ireland looking at this?
Yeah. So in that study, we looked closely at different durations of energy storage and some of the wider benefits that could bring to the integration of renewables and decarbonisation. And so we were looking not just at the zero carbon system services and the kind of reserve provision for which half our battery roughly is kind of sufficient, does the job. We were moving to 2-3 hour plus, up to 24 hours, even up to 100 hours. We looked at as a very long duration storage asset, and we found that the duration of the asset can be matched to different usages and different applications in the grid. Generally, if you're looking at applications when you're trying to absorb a lot of excess energy, so things like positioning storage assets behind constraints, helping to absorb the energy, reduce constraint, dispatch down, and then release that at times when it's needed, then the more storage capacity, that the greater the duration, the better. So that's not surprising, but we did find that once you got towards 12 to 24 hours, there was quite a big step change in the effectiveness of that storage. So certainly 24-hour storage has some very substantial impact. And we found, we did a case study of County Donegal, looking at that as an archetypal constrained region. We looked at adding in storage to behind that constraint, and we looked at how much of the dispatch down of wind and onshore renewables could be avoided. And if you deployed 24-hour plus storage, and it was a couple hundred megawatts, I think a few hundred megawatts from memory, then you could avoid almost all of the dispatch down. And I think from memory again, without that, the dispatch down levels were around the 25-30% mark. Now, smaller durations than that do have a benefit. It's not quite as dramatic, but yeah, say it depends on the application. What we find for sort of medium duration storage, so around the sort of maybe 3 to 12-hour mark, is that is quite effective at smoothing out some of the volatility in the market, so improving the capture price for renewables and helping to avoid really peak prices for end consumers as well. So that sort of mid duration is really good at that hour to hour within day volatility piece as well. So there's a lot of value in those assets too. So it is horses for courses, but for the bulk absorption of energy, then longer durations do bring a lot of benefit, we found.
Yeah, and I know the theme of this discussion so far has been the need to accelerate everything and get the pieces together to be able to facilitate that, Mark. And one of the big pieces that I guess is missing right now for that long duration energy storage is a route to market. So what does the future of system services look like? How can you bring that type of energy storage into the capacity market, or develop some sort of, say, new mechanism to pay for that storage to help alleviate the congestion that Dervla and Jeff were talking about? So that's, again, something that we do need to see accelerated over the next year or two. Just to keep going with some of the questions, and there's plenty filing in there. If anyone else would like to jump in, please do. The next question up was Sarah Armstrong. So talking about why we deviated away from the shaping our electricity future methodology regarding must-run units. So this is getting to the point, just to explain for anyone that is unaware, EirGrid currently have constraints. They're called must-run units. So those are thermal generation units, so coal or gas or oil or peat units that must be on in certain locations in the grid to help with grid stability, to make sure that the lights stay on And in EirGrid shaping our electricity future, I think they reduced the number of those units from 8 today down to about 4 by 2030. I can give my own reflection on it, but I'd love to invite maybe Jeff in to talk about what you need to do to replace those from a voltage point of view in particular, and maybe Mark in terms of inertia. But when it comes to carbon emissions, if you have a CCGT that's running at its min-gen, let's say it's 200 megawatts at a min-gen, if that's a muster-run unit and it's running right throughout the year, that's about 600,000 tons of CO2 just from that. So if you have 4 muster-run units on the grid that must be running at all times right throughout the year, you're already at about 2.5 million tons of carbon just from those, without leaving any space for any other type of running unit during times when renewables might not be available and you need to run more gas or coal or whatever it might be. So needing to reduce those mustering units is essential. It has to be done to meet the carbon budgets. There's no option. But I wonder, Jeff, could you maybe touch on some of the technologies that we might need if we do reduce those mustering units to replace them in terms of maybe voltage? And Mark, if you want to come in and touch on the inertia aspect of it as well.
Yeah, like the shaping assumption in this, the 4 units were nearly used as a mechanism to get to the 70. You know, that was how the 4 units was nearly determined. You know, with 5 units, you just won't get to 70. So going beyond 80, you have to consider those 4 units again and chipping away at that kind of operational constraint. Yeah, like when we looked at the current operational constraints, you know, we looked at what was coming in terms of voltage support, certainly in the south, you know, where you will have interconnection. There are STATCOMs and some reactors on the way. So certain areas of the system, you know, there are things happening that will make some of the operational constraint reduction more straightforward for EirGrid. Dublin is probably the key complication. There's probably something that there is certainly a voltage issue. And there's probably a little question mark over what offshore can do in terms of services in Dublin. The other thing as well is when you take, there's probably an active power aspect of that as well. You know, when you go down to a very low level of operational constraint, you probably do need some active power management in Dublin as well. But you know, in terms of what we did, we were looking at low flow N-1. We looked at you know, the more, you know, STATCOM synchronous condenser type of technology. The other areas then where we looked at was certainly the Northwest. If the Northwest can deliver, or if grid can be delivered in the Northwest, you know, it becomes isolated from you know, where the reactive power is being generated at the moment. So something certainly north of probably where the old peat used to be. You know, you need something there, you need something in Donegal, you need something in Mayo. That's certainly something that we would have seen in our analysis. I don't think I have anything else to add on that.
That's a really good overview, Jeff, and it highlights the importance of planning well for voltage. We often focus on power, but if you don't have your voltage right, your power system's just not going to work. Mark, do you want to come in on the inertia?
Yeah, and I think we've seen in previous studies. So we saw in Endgame 70 by 30 the importance and the impact that you can have by decarbonising system services, and it's exactly for the reason you set out, Noel, is you are burning through a lot of CO2 emissions by having to run gas-fired assets at a min-stable level to provide that inertia, to provide the reserve. So, you know, as we set out, the importance of displacing that is, it can't be overestimated, really. It's one of the key deltas between the 66 million ton of CO2 cumulative emissions and that 72 million level that we have under the shaping kind of assumptions. And so, you know, technology wise, you need provision of reserve. So battery storage is able to do that to a large degree. And so we assume that in the study. And then as Jeff set out, you need technologies like synchronous condensers in order to provide the inertia. So, both of those things, and the technology exists. So this is, I would say this lots of times, these may not be familiar. To many people, synchronous condensers may not be a sort of, household term that we're using regularly.
Yes, Mark.
But
yes.
Yes. But these are not mysterious devices as yet unknown. These are existing. They're operating in Europe. They're well understood. And in essence, quite a lot of is possible indeed to convert some of the existing kit we've got, the big heavy spinning machinery, which is already at power stations, can in some cases be repurposed in order to provide that inertia. And so, it's all about how do we ensure there's the investment and the deployment of that's needed as quickly as possible. And again, partly that comes back to the sort of arrangements to remunerate that capacity as well. I guess certainty around that, as Noel said, on the long duration storage side, the policy environment is key. And I think there is some movement there, and there is some signals from EirGrid that there will be tenders forthcoming. But yeah, the quicker the better, I think, on that.
Definitely, absolutely, yeah. No, thanks, guys. Very comprehensive answer there. We've about 20 minutes left. There's a fair few questions in the chat, so we might try and go through them relatively quickly so that we can try and get to all of them. I might take the next two. Actually, just Vanessa O'Connell commented on the need to get this message out there as quickly as we possibly can, and it really reinforces that the carbon budget targets being missed is a very powerful argument that everybody needs to be making. So what was the plan to present the report to government, to EirGrid, ABP and other relevant stakeholders? So you'll be glad to know, Vanessa, that that's actually a job that we have done a lot of in the last month. So a lot of this analysis was concluded at the end of May, and we spent most of June presenting early versions of the report to people in government, EirGrid and Bord Pleanála, other stakeholders, so that they could be fed into the ongoing discussions and debate on the carbon budget. So a lot of that has happened already. There's quite a few even attendees today from many of those stakeholders on the webinar. So we know that the carbon budgets are being set, the sectorial limits. So what will the electricity sector budget be? That should be set in the next week or so. So this report would have been something that fed in as evidence to that with government and with some of the modelers on that side too. Just David Lyons, then you asked the question, was there any analysis carried out utilising additional onshore res auctions working in parallel with ORES? So in short, there wasn't, and the reason for that was we wanted to focus on existing current policies. So we looked at what auctions have already been announced by DEC, and it was for that reason that we only went up to Res 4. We understand there's very likely to be a Res 5 auction as well in 2025, but the timetable for that hasn't yet been published. So we only focused on the policies that are out there that everybody knows about right now to show what's the current achievable budget under current policies. It's a great idea, and I'm sure it will happen to continue running auctions for onshore renewables later in the decade, but that's an added measure that needs to be done on top of the existing measure. So it's things like that that we need in order to bring the budget down below that 66 million tonnes. Mark, I might throw the next question to you. It's about corporate PPAs. So under the Climate Action Plan, there is a target for 15% of demand, so about 6 terawatt hours to be met by corporate PPAs. Was this included in the capacity out to 2030, or was it the auction estimates just used as proxies?
Yeah, so really good question. So we just used the auctions as proxies. We assumed all the volume going through to 2030 came through the RES and ORES auctions. The total volume we're achieving in the accelerated case is in line with the Climate Action Plan. So we've got the full build out of capacity, which is signalled there. I think it's a really good point. The government signalled that a good proportion of the new capacity must come from corporate PPA. So outside of the RES scheme, we we didn't take a specific view on that, I think, in the analysis. So I think it's fair to say, there hasn't been very swift progress on firm policies that will back that up, whereas the RES, scheme is in place. We've got, an outlined timetable from DEC. We've got volumes. We have ORES lined up. So that's much more certain. And therefore, we model that auction-driven volume in this study.
Yeah. And maybe just to complement that answer, Mark, a lot of corporate PPAs are happening at the moment. So in terms of, say, delivery of new renewables, it's roughly split a third between for onshore wind, I should say. Onshore wind, probably about 400 megawatts Res 1, 400 megawatts Res 2, 400 megawatts corporate PPAs. So they are moving right now, and that's incorporated into that volume that we've modeled. Maybe it just isn't explicitly labeled as the corporate PPAs. And again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there on enabling corporate PPAs. It's something that has been, I guess, sitting out there for quite some time now, probably well over a year, maybe a year and a half ago, since a really detailed consultation was run on enabling corporate PPAs by the SEI. So hopefully we'll see an output to that in the near future. Next question is for maybe Derval and Jeff. Might invite you guys in on this to comment on the benefit of deploying hybrid connections. Was that considered in the analysis, and maybe just any thoughts on enabling hybrid connections?
It wasn't a major focus of the analysis. There was so much res and batteries included that by proxy probably was, but we didn't specifically model, hybrid connections. So, and even if we did, we probably wouldn't have, calculated a specific benefit of them either. The focus on the grid analysis is usually to find problems and find a solution. So I guess that's the answer to that. Unless Derval, you have anything to add.
Like as Jeff said, I don't think it kind of went down to a nodal connection. It was more kind of area where you'd put in storage in particular areas, which I suppose could slightly reflect hybrid connections. But the hybrid connections themselves, like we spoke about, like that would probably reduce constraints in particular areas. And also back to what Mark was saying about kind of flattening out that curve, making it a bit more manageable, a bit more predictable. That if you have a kind of hybrid between battery and say solar, it's a kind of flattened curve for the operators to manage in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to maybe best use the existing network, hybrid connections are going to be crucial. If you already have generator connections developed, then making best use out of those connections is going to be very important. It goes to, might just actually skip, I'll come back to Jerry's question in a second, but it's just very related, John McGuckin's question, which is in relation to delivering all of these network upgrades, the renewable connections that we're going to need, it's going to lead to a very congested outage program over the course of a decade. So for anyone that might not be into the day-to-day of how the grid operates, in order to connect any new circuit or line into the existing transmission grid or a new renewable generator, you need to take an outage of surrounding infrastructure in order to make it safe for that connection to occur. And John's comment is that this might lead to a very congested outage schedule over the course of the decade, and how might this impact on carbon emissions? So is there a role there for outages during, say, outage seasons for storage or power flow controllers to be used to support the transmission system outages?
I think this is one of the biggest risks with the delivery of shaping and reinforcements, because we're not just talking about delivering shaping and delivering uprates and delivering new reinforcements. There's outages related to actual connections and getting renewables on the bars. There's also maintenance and urgent works that require outages as well as demand connections. So it's going to be a really intense outage program for the next 7 to 10 years to deliver on the grid development strategy. As you take out areas of the network, or plant, yeah, you probably will see further constraints during those outage seasons. I think storage, maybe power flow controllers, that can get a little bit complicated if it's kind of active management. It can be quite difficult, but maybe they can be deployed during outage seasons, and maybe mobile power flow controllers to help manage those level of constraints. The other side of it is maybe moving outside of the system operator's comfort zone and kind of taking a little bit more risk, pushing the system a little bit harder, and being maybe a little less conservative when it comes to outage program and outage management, and being that little bit more flexible. And as I said, taking that risk to be able to achieve more, maybe works, more outages in a particular area than we have seen in the past.
Further to Dervla's point there, some outages may not be possible with the current approach, due to security of supply reasons. So, new technologies for outaging, is probably something that needs to be looked in, or certainly new approaches, new strategies for taking circuits that, based on current approaches, just may not be possible. Like that's probably a major risk at the moment in delivering the strategy in the roadmap.
And your point being there, Jeff, that there's certain circuits that are so crucial to the security of supply to the electricity grid that you cannot take them out in some cases maybe for the entire year, but maybe for certain portions of the year. So being able to almost work around that limitation through new technologies is going to be critical.
Yeah.
No, thanks. I think hopefully, John, that covered off your question. I think outages and the outage schedule is something that we're going to have to really get a grip on over the next 10 years as well. And certainly in industry, we're going to have to try and find ways as best we can to try and facilitate and help EirGrid and ESB networks on that. Question in from Jerry McPhilly from Friends of the Earth. Can the panelists comment on the noted need to phase out fossil fuel generation through the likes of battery storage, demand-side response and interconnection, while further gas-fired stations are planned to be developed, and that leads to the potential for carbon lock-in? So I might kick this one over to Mark. I think this goes back to the point of the capacity being there, but hopefully not used very often.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think there does need to be an awareness, I think, from investors, from project developers, and from EirGrid and the government, that gas-fired capacity, which may be built under the capacity market, in the near term, may not run very much in the future. And we're not talking 20 years in the future. It could be 5 to 10 years in the future, that there's a drastic reduction, a quick reduction in the number of running hours. And in many ways, there needs to be, if we're going to get anywhere near the required carbon budgets. Now, in my view, that there is this difference between having the capacity there for backup, and when it's really needed in the near term, while we bring on low carbon alternatives and the bulk production of energy. And I think it's that distinction for me which is key. And there does need to be an awareness, and there needs to be a view of how are those assets going to be remunerated if we do need them for backup in the toughest hours for some years to come. Then how are we going to ensure that they earn enough to provide that service that might be required, because that isn't necessarily going to come through the energy market, which has been a core source of gross margins for those sorts of assets in the past. So that holistic, picture around remuneration of those assets, making sure that it's appropriate, it's not incentivizing them to put out volume onto the system, which is not needed. There needs to be the right incentives to minimize emissions. Now, that's often well aligned with the requirement to minimize costs on the system, but not always. And particularly as we go forward, you can end up with a misalignment there. So we do need to recenter, I think, the entire market around how do we optimize to minimize emissions. But that needs to be thought through in those business cases. I think it's a really good point.
Definitely, Mark, and you can kind of see how the carbon price is trying to do that in the energy market, but maybe isn't quite getting there. I mean, we're still seeing, for example, in a high gas market price environment that we're in right now, coal is nearly more economically viable as a fuel source compared to gas. And you're seeing countries transition towards a higher carbon emitting fuel source like Germany to conserve gas. So it's really around how to align the electricity market with the need to minimize emissions, and the capacity market and system services market being built around that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe one final point on the gas lock-in. I think there's another question maybe that refers to this as well. In my view, it's really important that as far as possible, there is a route to decarbonize these assets baked in to the technology and to the business plan. So where possible, that there is a conversion route to green hydrogen or an electrofuel or some kind of low carbon fuel that is viable for a gas turbine or for a gas engine or for whatever technology it might be. Again, those retrofit routes are absolutely viable. So we work a lot with the OEMs. They all tell us this is well-established technology. You can get dual fuel gas turbines, hydrogen and natural gas, no problem. The OEMs are very confident about that. There are upgrade routes, but it's just assuring that's thought through. So if there's a decision that can be made in the spec upfront that makes that upgrade route easier in coming years, then ensuring that that's done, and there is an exit path from fossil.
Absolutely. Hopefully, I know the long-awaited hydrogen strategy from government. I think there's a consultation coming out hopefully in the next few days. I think it was supposed to be certainly early this month that it was being published, and that might give some signals as to current plans to transition towards hydrogen as a long-term fuel source. And that's covering off the question from Richard just at the end there around the need to utilize hydrogen as a future security of supply fuel. Just one thing to add to your comments there, Mark, in relation to answering that question. The Endgame report that we worked together on last year and published June 2021 looked at how to move to a fully zero carbon power system, and hydrogen as a fuel source for the thermal units is a really critical part of that piece of analysis, including quantifying the amount of hydrogen you might need, the amount of thermal generation that you might need to transition over to hydrogen in order to make that viable. So seeing that come to life in the next 10, 12 years is going to be, again, very central to decarbonising the grid. Just a very good question in from Paul McGoldrick. So what's the associated proposal to enable this faster deployment of renewables in the accelerated decarbonisation scenario? So delivery under RES, it's very much a mix of grid development and a generator-led programme. So how can the latter be accelerated? I might have a go at answering this, and if anyone wants to jump in, please do so. So very critically, there is definitely two sides to a connection of a generator to the grid. There's the air grid and ESP networks works, which enable the connection to take place, but then there's also the generator-led aspect to the program. So the two things that it really comes down to one thing actually that is going to be underpinning all of this, and that's the speed of the planning system. So if we can speed up the amount of projects that get planning to enable more volume to go into res auctions, that's going to allow for hopefully higher levels of capacity to compete, higher levels of capacity to be procured in the auctions. So for very good reasons, Res 1 and Res 2 didn't procure the maximum amount of volume that it could have. And that's really down to the amount of volumes entering the auction. So if you can get more solar, more wind through planning, then you can get more volume into the auctions. And I'll come on to why that's important in a second. But just from an onshore wind point of view, there is about 1,200 megawatts of onshore wind currently in the planning system, and more than half of that has been there since 2020. So really trying to turn that 18-week statutory guideline in terms of turning around planning, turning that into an actual 18-week guideline instead of 18 months, which a lot of projects are seeing in real life, coming through and planning, that's going to be a big one. And why is that important? Well, it's important because if you are a developer with a portfolio of projects, you typically have crews of people that are working to deliver this grid infrastructure. There's been a few, or sorry, generator infrastructure. There's a few excellent examples from companies that have had Res 1 and Res 2 projects, and immediately after Res 1 projects concluded, they've already begun the work on their Res 2 projects and enabling that generator-led program to deliver faster. So if you can keep crews active across projects at all times with no downtime, then that's going to be able to deliver a much better generator-led program than having to maybe allow those crews to, in some cases, go off to other countries in Europe to deliver renewable projects while there's a bit of downtime in a particular developer's portfolio or just in general across the system. So having annual auctions that are fed by a very good planning system and a very good grid connection system is going to deliver faster generator-led programs. And I hope that wasn't a very long-winded answer to your question, Paul. I think we've got one question left and we've got 1 minute left as well. So good timing. Jeff, might throw this one over to you because I know we've both worked on this in the past. So would you recommend any changes to the transmission system security planning standards to enable use of new technologies and storage to provide more grid capacity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I'd love to see the standards go through a detailed review. You know, in the past there were different voltage standards. The one thing that you could look at is maybe the thermal overload standard. You know, there could be scope there to even increase that. I'm probably talking about the short-term emergency loading capability. Certainly overhead lines have the potential to do maybe more under emergency situations. That's probably an out there kind of suggestion, but I do think it's technically possible. You know, where it's currently 110%, you could do 115% for 15 minutes, we'll say, whereas at the moment it's 110% for 30 minutes. I think there's evidence there to, you know, again, from the point of view of giving a little bit more capacity throughout the system, that is the one area that jumps out to me.
And especially, Jeff, just to add to that, I mean, if you, a lot of those standards are based on if you lose a power station, you're reliant on power coming from another power station, which has a startup time, which might be slower. But if you're relying on things like battery storage, which has, they're instantaneous power sources,
yeah,
you can maybe rely on some of that 15-minute time frame rather than your 30-minute, which is very based on a startup time of a traditional generator.
And that's the point. You're on the money there. You know, it's been around for a few decades, that standard. So, you know, even operators at the moment, I'd imagine that, you know, there are quicker mechanisms to even just redispatch plant. So yeah, you throw batteries or faster acting technologies in there. That's one area where you could get benefit.
Perfect. Very good. I think just the final question, Richard, I think we've covered off your hydrogen aspect. One quick one to you, Mark, just it's a second question at the end of that comment. Have Baringa included higher emissions from diesel sets as part of the demand response in the analysis?
So yes is the quick answer. So those emissions from diesel-backed DSR are included. Those diesel-backed DSR assets don't necessarily run all that much in terms of number of hours, which is why they're very small. They don't show up on the charts, but they are in there accurately. Yeah.
Brilliant. No, thanks, Mark. And thanks very much to everybody that submitted questions. I'd like to draw the webinar to a close now. Really like to thank our expert panel here this morning, Mark Turner, partner at Baringa Partners, Jeff Kelliher, specialist consultant at TNEI Ireland, and Dervla O'Brien, country manager at TNEI Ireland. Thanks very much for attending. All of the slides presented this morning will be made available to all the attendees, as well as the recording from the session, in case you'd like to watch back after the fact. So thank you very much. We'll talk to you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Noel.